Okay, welcome back. We're going to discuss our last poem together in this video, "O Captain, My Captain" by Walt Whitman. There is information you have to know before reading this poem, otherwise none of it is going to make any sense. So, the important background information for this whole poem is written about the Civil War that took place in the United States, so during the 60s. And we talked a little bit about this in our study of To Kill a Mockingbird. So the Civil War was it was the Confederation, which is your southern states, against the Union, which were your northern states. All right, and thankfully the northern states, the Union, won. However, at the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln in 1865 was assassinated. So there was this conflict between this rejoicing and celebration that, Jim Crow laws would be abolished, that segregation would be no more. That was a really, really good thing, but at the same time, that happy sort of emotion was conflicted with this mourning and lamenting because Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. So that is what this whole poem is about. So the entire The entire poem works as an extended metaphor for the death of Abraham Lincoln and the victory of the Union, the northern states, in the Civil War. So there's a few different references made that won't make sense unless you understand that, yes, this is about the Civil War. One of those being the ship represents America. The fearful trip that's spoken about in the poem represents the Civil War, and the prize won would obviously be the Union defeating the Confederation. Okay, so then, if the ship is America, the fearful trip is the Civil War, the prize won is the Civil War and the Union winning, who would be the captain? Correct. The captain is Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so I'm going to read through the poem in its entirety one time over. And while I'm doing this, I'd like you to consider two things. First, any sort of important language. So like we've talked about, whenever we do a close reading or analysis of poetry, the focus is always on the language and what the language suggests about the tone of the poem, what the language suggests about the attitude of the narrator. So what I'd like you to consider here, as I'm reading through this, is what does the language suggest about how Whitman feels about Abraham Lincoln? And then I also want you to consider the rhyming scheme. Do you notice anything peculiar? Okay, and then we're going to talk about the significance of those two things specifically. Also, for the heck of it, I want you to consider the visual layout of this poem. Because poems, like we've talked about, they speak on so many different levels. The metrical rhythm of a poem can be symbolic, as can the visual representation of a poem. And in this poem, that is the case. So the way in which the stanzas are actually visually collected together is significant of something. So I'd like you to consider that. The visual layout of the poem, the way in which the poem looks. What could this suggest? Okay, so let's read through it, and I'd like you to consider these three things as I do so. O Captain, My Captain by Walt Whitman. O Captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on my deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribbons wreaths, for you the shores a crowding, for you they call the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head, it is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored, safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object worn. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. So let's consider the first question. What does the language suggest about how Whitman feels about Abraham Lincoln? Do we get the idea that he's a fan of the guy? Do we get the idea that he hates Abraham Lincoln? And what would suggest this? Okay, so hopefully you got the hint that he's quite a fan of Abraham Lincoln. He calls him, "Oh captain, my captain." So the repeated use of the word "my" here, go ahead and highlight this. He's ready to associate himself with his captain, claiming him as his own, okay? So for him to say, "Oh captain, my captain, oh captain, my captain," at the beginning of each stanza, it suggests a personal connection between the two of them. So the repeated use of the word "my" demonstrates that Whitman is ready to associate himself with his captain. Claiming him as his own. It suggests a personal connection between the two of them. There's also another word that he calls his captain a few times. So, of course, he repeatedly uses the word "my," "oh, captain, my captain." Here we go. "Here, captain, dear father." And he calls him father a couple different times. And again, it's essentially suggesting the same thing. Father is a term of endearment. It's a word we use towards someone we think kindly of. So, again, it would suggest that he feels a personal connection to his captain. And sees him as a fatherly figure. Fatherly figures ideally are meant to be a figure that's there to protect you, a strong figure, someone who's going to stand up for you, someone who's going to do the right thing. This is how Walt Whitman is suggesting that he sees Abraham Lincoln. All right? So the fact that he repeatedly suggests that he has this personal connection with this captain adds to the sorrowful mood of the stanza, because it emphasizes the narrator's affection for his captain, making his death then all the more tragic. Obviously, if you don't care for someone, if you don't have a personal connection to someone, you're not going to be as negatively affected by their death as you would be should you have had that personal connection. So here's where we have to notice that the poem is visually And in terms of theme, it's broken up. Okay, so we have our first four lines, which are pretty happy, actually. So the first 4 lines of each stanza they give an impression of rejoiceful celebration. Okay, the first 4 lines are always talking about the prize that is won, that the fearful trip is done, the war is over, the Union has won, hooray. Okay, so the first 4 lines, I will make this blue. So we'll say the first verse. So the first verse is speaking of celebration and rejoicing that the fearful trip is done, that the Civil War is over. However, then we go into a chorus. So a chorus is it's still 4 lines, but just 4 shorter lines. And the chorus here has a very different tone than the verse. So our verse is happy, it's rejoiceful, it's celebrating. Now if we read the chorus, the tone, the attitude of it is much different. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, for on my deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. So here, chorus, which is just 4 shorter lines. Go. It conveys a lamenting and a mournful attitude. So we go from being really happy and celebrating to being extremely sad and lamentful and mournful of the captain's death. This is the whole point. This is the whole attitude of the poem. Okay? Now, before I get into that just a little bit more, I want us to consider the rhyming scheme of the verse. So the first 4 lines are verse, the ones that are happy and celebratory. They're made of 2 couplets. Okay? Let me write this here in green. A couplet is just 2 lines that rhyme. That's it. So the verse, I'm talking here about the first 4 lines. Are made of 2 lines that rhyme, which is known as a couplet. Okay? However, the rhyming is a little bit different. So, O captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack. The prize is sought and won. Done and won. Perfect rhyming. But if we look at our second couplet here, the port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessels grim and daring. Here's what we have. What we call a slant rhyme. So exulting and daring, they don't really rhyme, but they both end in ing, so they kind of sound okay together. That's what we call a slant rhyme. So our first couplet is a perfect rhyme. Our second couplet employs a slant rhyme, which is words that rhyme but not really. Words that rhyme, kind of. Okay, so exulting, daring, they don't sound terrible together, but it's not like one and done. Those ones we know for sure rhyme. Okay, this plays into the thematic significance of the poem itself. So, the fact that the first couplet rhymes perfectly and then the second couplet doesn't rhyme perfectly, it makes the poem seem like something's off, like something's wrong, like the order of it, something is not quite right. So these couplets, the rhyming scheme evokes the sense that the death of the captain has upset the natural order of things. Including the very rhymes themselves. All right? So when we think of a war being won, we would generally think of the captain being there to celebrate and rejoice in his or her victory, and the fact that in this case Abraham Lincoln is not upsets the order of things. It upsets the way in which things ought to be. And the poet, Walt Whitman, works that into his rhyming scheme. Okay? So done, won, exalting, daring. It doesn't sound perfect, and that's because the situation, just like the poem, it isn't perfect. It's not supposed to be. Or it's sad that it's not. Okay, so then if we consider the rhyming scheme and then the visual representation of the poem itself together, and we ask ourselves, what does that say then to what the whole poem is about, to the thematic significance of the whole poem, we can come up with the fact that the whole poem evokes the sense that the speaker is divided between feelings of success and reconciling his emotional reaction to the death of his captain. He's conflicted, he's happy, he's relieved, but he's also extremely sad and torn. Okay? So the whole poem, and by the whole poem I mean everything, the visual representation of it, the rhyming scheme, and of course just what the poem is saying itself, and the message. Evokes the sense that the speaker is divided between feelings of success and rejoicing and mourning and lamenting the loss of his captain. He's not exactly sure how he should feel at this point in time. Okay? And if you're a little bit confused by what I mean by the visual representation, I just mean if we look here at the whole stanza itself, so when we put the verse and the chorus together, it's divided. We see that. So the verse here looks different. It just visually looks different. It's longer lines than the chorus. Okay? And that's done on purpose, again, just to suggest that there is a division between the author's feelings of success, feelings of celebration, and his feelings of dread, his feelings of grief, his feelings of mourning. That's all it is. Okay? So green, here he's feeling, here he's happy, we'll just make it super simple, here he's sad. And that's what the whole poem is about, how he's conflicted between these two emotions. Okay? That is it. That is the important things I wanted us to notice. So the language, oh captain, my captain, referring to him repeatedly as a father, the way in which we can actually visually manipulate a poem to have deeper meaning, as well as, what was the last thing? Oh, the rhyming scheme. how rhyming schemes can even play into the thematic significance of a poem. Okay, so those are the three big things for "O Captain, My Captain" by Walt Whitman, and that's the last poem we're going to look at. Okay, I did figure out a way to quiz you guys on this. I'm just making a quiz for you next week, in which I'm going to ask you specific questions about each poem, and we're going to go from there. Okay, have a great week.